So I'm very pleased to introduce Peter Newborne, who is a research associate here at ODI, specialising in water policy. But importantly, he spent the first 10 years of his career working in law and finance in the context of the City of London and businesses. And I think that will bring still a rather interesting and important perspective as we begin to think about the roles perhaps of big business and of finance and of law in relation to some of these Nexus challenges. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for those introductions, which will assist greatly, I think, in pursuing this analysis of Nexus. So I'm going to talk about energy and water in Brazil, and I will try to put on the table some observations from the case study in relation to the Nexus. Now, in starting to prepare for this talk, I thought I should look at a Brazilian Portuguese dictionary to see where this word sits. So this is I'm trying to transport you to Brazil, and this is what I found. Now, the risk of producing Spanish-sounding Portuguese, ligação refers to links and connections, and the second meaning is coherencia, which is coherence, which I take to be a reference to this issue of integration. Now, it seems to me that in the Nexus concept there's two different elements, a descriptive and analytical element, and I think the question here is how energy and water are related. Energy and water issues and concerns and resources are related in a given context. And then the normative issue is how far are energy and water uses planned and managed in that context in an integrated manner. And the normative element is, of course, that the idea is to promote better integration. So I think that is the framing using the dictionary of the country in question. Now, the principal source of electricity supply in Brazil is very much hydropower. I'll get to the figures in a moment. But the point, of course, of that is hydropower is quintessentially a water energy nexus activity. Hydro, of course, referring etymologically in its origins to the Greek word for water, need I remind you. So hydropower is, of course, water power. And so here I'm going to focus on the water energy nexus, and I think the Burkina Faso case study will look more at the food agriculture aspects. So let's look at sustainable energy in Brazil through the Nexus lens. I'll start off with some context and status on Brazil and the Amazon. And I should emphasize that this study carried out by ODI was carried out with very close collaboration with Brazilian partners. And over a year, we have been working for us to understand better the sustainable energy context in the country. Secondly, connections. How are water and energy related in Brazil? And I will refer to the big country syndrome and some opportunities and challenges of water and energy in Brazil. Thirdly, let's look at integration. How far is planning and management integrated? And some synergies and trade-offs emerge. And then I will put forward some suggestions of observations and lessons from the Nexus. So let's start with context and status in Brazil. It's a big country. And if you look at the national electricity grid, you'll see this is a map. This is the grid overlaid on a map of Europe. And that puts very much into scale the challenge of building and maintaining the grid, which Brazilian planners and engineers have accomplished. So it's called the Brazilian Interconnected Power System, and I'll come back to the word interconnected in a moment. And in terms of the electricity that is supplied for that grid, hydropower in 2010 was supplying 72% of electricity supply in Brazil, which is a high figure, backed up by thermal, coal, natural gas, oil, diesel, and nuclear power stations, and then in small contributions, some other renewable sources of electricity, some wind and a little solar. Now, the potential of those is recognized, and that share will increase, but at the moment it is a small share. Now this electricity supply has enabled the Brazilians to connect more households to electricity and to continue from a strong base this connection. So now more than 9 out of 10 households in Brazil are connected to electricity, and with the development benefits that brings in terms of obviously household appliances, children who can study at dark, and integration into the country through media and other electricity powered appliances. So it has been a very positive story in that regard. And the high hydro element is largely responsible for Brazil maintaining a high proportion of renewable energy in its energy mix. So if you look on the right, Brazil is at 45%, as compared with Latin American countries substantially less in 2010 at 29%, and other upper middle income countries lower still. So that is an enviable record as well, largely built on this hydro element. Not exclusively, but largely. Now, focusing on the Amazon, because a lot of hydro is and will be supplied from the Amazon region, here's a map provided by WF Brazil, and thank you for that. The Brazilian Amazon is nearly 4 million square kilometers, and it includes 13 major subbasins with a vast area of wetlands and rivers. Now, if I can point to the, if you can see the Madeira subbasin at the bottom in the middle, to give you an idea of size, that is over 550 square kilometers, which is bigger than the area of Spain. So this is a very substantial area of land and water. Now, what the Ministry of Energy says is there is less competition for water in the Amazon region than in other countries. Now, looking at the regional picture, that has some persuasive logic until you think that actually water issues come down to the local context. And at local level, competition between large hydropower plants and other water uses can be intense, and there can be heavy local environmental impacts on fish migration and diversity, sediment transport, etc. So when you're thinking of water, planners will look at national level, at aggregate figures, and at regional level, but it is very important to disaggregate those figures and look at the local level. Now, that raises the question, or one of the questions for planners, both in the water sector and the energy sector, is what further potential there is for hydropower in the Amazon, because there is potential, but what are the limits? Now, in case you wonder, in case one is tempted to think that the Amazon is a sort of empty space, here again are some maps showing the indigenous lands in the Amazon basin, protected under Article 231 of the Brazilian Constitution, and on the right, conservation units, different types of protected area in the basin. So that is a starting position from a conservationist point of view, and from the National Indigenous Agency, FUNAI, as to the map of the Amazon. Now, energy planners will have other maps, and I suppose one of the Nexus issues is how to bring those maps together. So let's look at the connections, energy-water connections in Brazil. The big country syndrome has some disadvantages, as well as the advantages of being a strong economy, an upper middle income country, 190 million plus inhabitants, and a country with great capacities and strengths. The first point is that transmission from power generation source to user in this big country can be very far. So the hydropower, the prevailing hydropower model, relies on conveying electricity over great distances, especially from the north, the Amazon, to distant locations in the south, southeast, and central west. Now, the sources disagree on the rate of power loss in transmission along those high voltage lines. In fact, the figures are rather bewilderingly different. So the Ministry of Energy says it's just 4% of loss in conveying electricity. Other figures go up to 10% and more. One point is that the grid itself is not 100% interconnected. There are transportation bottlenecks, as the energy people explain. That was a gesture of Nexus. In terms of limit to the grid expansion, the remaining households in Brazil, many of them are located in rural areas and many of them in isolated remote communities. Now, the grid is too expensive to extend to a few houses 1,000 or hundreds of kilometers from a city. So there are other energy solutions which are required off-grid and mini-grid. In terms of grid operation, you can imagine the challenges of managing different power sources across that kind of space, equivalent to the size of Europe. Now, hydropower will give you seasonal sort of electricity in that river flows will vary. To give an example, in the Amazon, river flows between the wet and dry seasons may vary by a factor of up to 10. So hydropower will give you different capacity at different times. And for that, you need thermal power plants as a reserve or other power plants as a reserve. Now, that will involve burning fossil fuels amongst other options. So that is a challenge. But there are possible complementarities between regions, and you can try and counterbalance different renewable sources. So, for example, if you put wind on the northeast coast of Brazil, you may be getting power when river levels inland, 2,000 kilometers inland, are much lower. And maybe you could argue for much more wind and solar in Brazil, more investment in that, and perhaps less hydro investment. So there are a number of challenges, with some balancing to be done by the operators of the national grid, which may keep them busy and maybe losing sleep overnight. But of course, their job is to keep the lights on. And there was a major power crisis in Brazil in the early 2000s. So let's look at integration. One interesting point, I think, in terms of Nexus, is that the Brazilian constitution provides for the payment of royalties for utilization of water resources, including for hydro. So when you build a hydro plant, 3% of the revenues from the sales from that plant will go to the state and 3% to the municipality, which provides a useful boost to local government funds. Now, those go into general funds according to the way that all funds going into local government are required to be spent. It's not a particular development fund for people who are for any special constituency. It's a general fund. We worked out that 2 large dams on the Madeira River, 2 dams at nearly 4 gigawatts each, so these are big power plants, would generate in the region of 8% of the budget, or a boost of 8% of the budget of the local municipality, Porto Velho. So that is a considerable boost. But it is ex post facto in that maybe the consultation of the state and municipality, as I will come to, is not full, and after the event you will receive your royalty. So it is specific recognition of the energy-water link and the use of water for energy, but the financial compensation is sort of ex post facto. Now, one important issue of integration, and Melissa mentioned the challenge of integrating economic development and social development with also the environmental aspect, is that when you put up a big dam, one of these large dams, and you can see the picture on the right, a substantial wall across the river, mitigating and compensating for local impacts is not the same as avoiding those impacts. I mean, there is improved project practice in Brazil, and international assessors have recently, last year, been to evaluate the Girão hydropower project, which I was privileged to visit with a Brazilian colleague, in the Madeira River. And they basically said that is a good, well-managed project. But it doesn't mean that there are no losers from that project. Putting a big piece of infrastructure carries consequences. And the international assessors highlighted this question. The the significant question on the economic sustainability of new settlement. There were 500 families displaced. Query a new settlement which looks pretty good but is 90 kilometres away from the municipal capital. How will that fare in the medium term? So I think that's an important issue, that you don't build these dams unless you have to and you need the electricity, because they do affect people's lives fundamentally, and mitigation and compensation, as I say, is not the same as not building the no project option. And I think we have to point out the trade-off between local environmental and social impacts and the global implications of reduced GHG emissions. I mean, hydro is generally low on GHG emissions, depending on some complex technical issues about reservoirs and vegetation. But essentially, you're balancing your trading off local impacts and global impacts. So some observations and lessons, if I dare use that word, from the Nexus. I think you have to add land into this Nexus picture. So it's going to be there's going to be 3 or 4 words in this Nexus story, because of course when you build a reservoir for hydro, it sits over land. Now, how much land it sits over depends whether it's a run-of-river project, where you essentially use the river flow and you don't have storage or not much storage behind. But a storage reservoir will have a larger space of land it'll occupy. Now that gives you storage of electricity when you wish to use it. So the trend in Brazil to build more run-of-river, to displace less people and cause less environmental impacts, does raise, from an energy point of view, the question about the vulnerability to drought. And you may have seen in the papers that Sao Paulo state is suffering at the moment from quite a heavy drought down in the southeast of the country. Well, what's the position in the Amazon? The climate change models are rather contradictory as to the future of river flows in the Amazon. But this drought vulnerability issue is certainly an important consideration. Now, it seems to me, to complicate issues a bit or to elucidate them, I'll leave you to decide that, we need to look at the energy nexus. We want to get out of silos, but the silos have to keep their house in order. And whereas Brazil has achieved many things in terms of sustainable energy, building its supply, doubling its energy production from 1990 to 2010, which was a key policy goal, and being very effective in doing that. On the other side, in terms of demand management, there does seem to be a lack of coherent policy. Brazil has, in fact, a poor record in energy efficiency, and that's partly because of modest government funding for energy conservation. And judging from Sustainable Energy for All global tracking, Brazil is currently going in the opposite direction in terms of the target for improvement in energy intensity. So that's the amount of energy used per unit of production. So in comparison with great achievements, there's a big question mark. And one of the people we spoke to, who's an expert on energy, said this is a serious aspect of energy policy requiring urgent change. So there's a sort of internal nexus issue even before the energy people work with water people. Now, one thing that's very clear in this nexus in Brazil is that energy is the dominant driver. Energy planning and decision-making in Brazil, the process lacks, we think, and our Brazilian partners agree, transparency. The energy planning is confined to a narrow government circle. Proposals of the Ministry of Energy are effectively politically protected without exposure to robust independent review. There are seminars and presentations by the ministry, but the view of the people we talked to was this was rather to validate what they'd already decided rather than invite genuine debate. Now, for example, in this country, Ofgem has a statutory duty to consult on its modelling before it reports to the minister. So for 2 months, experts and lay people in this country have the opportunity to unpick the modelling and look at some of the figures. Now, that kind of example is surely worth considering. Meanwhile, the national water regulator called ANA is sidelined, and the National Council on Energy Policy is also sidelined, and one person referred to it as almost completely ignored. So this is a a council which has a mandate under the Constitution, supposedly, to advise the presidency on energy policy, and it's being sidelined. Now, what's happening? Well, it seems that there are major interests behind the current policy direction, and that includes proposals, aggressive proposals for major further hydropower expansion in the Amazon, and there seems to be perhaps a hidden nexus of construction and industry. I can substantiate that. So there's a political economy sort of nexus question, and one thing to note is decisions to build these large power plants are effectively made in Brasilia long before local consultation with local people. So I think there's an issue there, and there doesn't seem to me to be very much energy-water nexus in planning. And finally, I picked up that the presidential campaign of Marina Silva, who you may have read is a new entrant into the presidential campaign in Brazil. The plan of action of Silva's campaign refers to this issue, and it says it is necessary to re-establish medium and long-term planning of the energy sector that is integrated, beginning with the reactivization and valorization of the National Council of Energy Policy and its role in the planning of national energy policy with the participation of civil society. Sorry, I've probably overrun, but I have stopped.